If you're curious about aviation at all, or have always wanted to get your private pilot's license, you should try a discovery flight. For me personally, I've always wanted to fly, but I've always put it off as some kind of someday goal. Not today, maybe someday. But recently I decided the time is now. I'm going to book a flight with my local flight school and see what it's like. And now I'm hooked. Once I decided to do a discovery flight, I started doing some research and found that the best way to tackle it was to go through my local flight school at my local airport and do a discovery flight that way. I sent an email to a flight school at my local airport and they worked with me on availability to book my first flight. Once I was booked with the flight school, they sent me a few different emails, mostly just confirmation, but the other was for an app called Flight Circle, which is used to track your hours toward your flight progress. So if you're pursuing a license, you would log it in Flight Circle to know how many hours you've booked, and it's kind of like a reservation system for the flight school. So on the day of my flight, I showed up to the airport and found the flight school and waited for my instructor to arrive. Now if you're wondering, how formal is a discovery flight? Well, to put it this way, when I met my flight instructor, he asked how many hours I had booked in the air so far, to which I replied, none, this is my first flight. And he was pretty stoked that he got to be the first one to take me up in the air and show me the ropes. I'm not really sure what I was expecting for my first flight. I guess because it's a discovery flight, that it felt like I was going to just be on some kind of tour, but that wasn't the case at all. Essentially, I was flying the aircraft for the most part, and the flight instructor was just making sure we didn't die. So that right there made me feel immediately like I was a student pursuing a pilot's license and not just a tourist. The nice thing about this was, allowing me to fly, it felt more like practice and learning instead of an experience. I'm sure if you aren't comfortable trying to do this immediately, you can go on more of an experience type flight where the instructor's going to take the wheel and he's going to do all of the flying and you just get to sit in the small aircraft and kind of observe, see how things go. I was pretty eager to get out there myself, so I just took control and he made sure I didn't do anything stupid. The first thing that we did was went out to the aircraft, which was a Cessna 172. We went through and ran through a pre-flight checklist and made sure everything on the plane was sound and secure before we took it out. While running through the pre-flight checklist, my flight instructor was very thorough, and I felt that sometimes he was even over-explaining just in case I had never been around certain things on the airplane, which, as someone who knows cars pretty well, there were things on airplanes that I was not familiar with, like pitot tubes or magnetos, things that aren't found on cars. These are also older aircraft generally when they're training, so I would have to guess this was a 70s or 80s Cessna. So a lot of this stuff is, even if you do know modern planes, you might not see something from 30, 40 years ago. So it was pretty interesting, and I'm glad that my flight instructor was very thorough because some of this was new to me. Once the pre-flight checklist was done, we both got into the aircraft and started it up. I sat in the left seat, he sat in the right. We ran through a few different things like safety and basic controls, and then we were off to the races. Like I said, for a discovery flight, I wasn't sure if this was going to be a ride-along situation where I sit in the passenger seat and I just watch the pro do different things in the aircraft. But no, I was mistaken. I was literally thrown right in and immediately operating the airplane. What I thought might have happened was the flight instructor would do all the takeoff, all that stuff, get us to a secure elevation, and then I would take over controls and just see what it's like. But that's not the case. Essentially, I taxied the airplane, I took off, I flew us up to elevation, did the maneuvers. The only thing I didn't do was land. Before we were even off the ground, we went over most of the controls, and we went through basic communication things. Mostly that we need to stay in communication with each other so we know who's manning the controls and there's no confusion. So anytime you give up control, you say my controls or your controls, and they repeat it back to each other. That way it's crystal clear who's on the controls. Otherwise, mistakes could happen and something bad could happen. Most of the controls felt pretty good to me. The one thing I wasn't used to is the resistance on different controls. Like you would, when you're playing a simulator, you don't feel any resistance. But when you are up in the air, you're feeling bumps constantly. You're feeling different forces acting on the different controls. Even on the ground, I'll be honest, I struggled with the rudder pedals. It was harder to keep the plane in a straight line than I thought, mostly because I had been playing a simulator where all you're using is an Xbox controller to steer the airplane, and that was pretty simple. So once I got into the airplane, you're pressing these pedals and I'm trying my hardest to keep it on this line. I was able to do it, but it's a lot trickier than it seems. And don't get me started on turns. That was a little more difficult than I thought. So overall, I thought taxiing was probably the area of improvement I need to work on the most. So anyway, once we reach the end of the taxiway and we're about to go onto the runway, you stop short. Did a few different checks. We did a run-up checklist. Basically make sure all the functions are ready to go, the brakes work, the engine can throttle all the way up, everything's ready to go. We make a call to air traffic control, and then we make our way onto the runway once we're cleared, and we did the takeoff. And like I said, I am not that comfortable on the rudder pedals. We slowly started to veer to the left, and there's so much happening all at once. You're speeding up, you're in a plane, things are vibrating, you're not used to it. That we're slowly making our way to the left. And then by the time that point happened, we were already at about 55 miles per hour. So the instructor instructed me to, rotate. So pull back on the yoke and start getting air. Once we hit that 55, 60 miles per hour and you're pulling back on the yoke, you start to feel wind under the wings, and you feel the lift kind of just like pull you up, and it's such a weird feeling because I've never felt that. Obviously, I've flown in large aircraft where they're more immune to turbulence and wind, but in a small aircraft you immediately feel it pull you up. You can feel it in the seat of your pants and your body. So it pulls you up. And as we're ascending, I think we were ascending 500 feet or so to get out of the traffic pattern, or maybe 1,000 feet. And I noticed it was a lot more difficult to keep the plane level than, and this is probably on me for playing simulators, but it was a lot more difficult than playing a simulator on easy mode. So, really, I think simulators are great, but you need to play them on the most difficult settings for them to be even useful. The simulator was kind of good for basic procedures, how some of this works, but for me, if I could go back in time, I would play a little more in depth on a harder difficulty so that I was fully prepared. Because an Xbox controller does not prepare you to fly an airplane. That's plain and simple. I knew better, yet there I was. But like I said, I think that's the fun part of flying an airplane, is you get to feel all those different forces acting on your body. You're going into a turn, you can feel the weight of the airplane. You're hitting pockets of air, you feel that gut drop feeling. It makes it exciting. And you get to see all the scenery, you get to see all the things, you recognize landmarks, cars, from just a whole different vantage point that you would never get. And even in a simulator, you can see those things, but it's not the same. Even with the technology, it's just not the same as seeing something at a certain time of day from a certain perspective or elevation. Once we were at a cruising altitude around 3,000 feet, my flight instructor had me work through different types of maneuvers of the aircraft. So, for example, we would do like ascending, descending, banking left, banking right, ascending while banking or descending. And then finally we did like a reference turn. You find a location on the ground and you circle it in the aircraft while using different reference points to maintain a good circle. So the nice thing about this was when I would start making small mistakes, my flight instructor was on top of it. One of the first ones was using both hands on the yoke. I don't know, it feels like a car, right? It's almost like a U shape, and it's got two handles there. So to me, naturally, after driving for however many years, it feels comfortable to be like this. But flying is a one-handed thing. So you need to get comfortable flying a yoke with one hand because you need your other hand to be able to operate other controls in the cabin. My flight instructor had a pretty good sense of humor, whenever he would catch me with two hands on the yoke, he said he was going to start squirting me with a squirt bottle and tell me no, because he wanted me to break the habit quickly, which I did by mid-flight once I was a little more comfortable with the controls. One thing he had me practice was flying with just a couple fingers on the yoke and getting used to flying gently and not white knuckling, because flying's supposed to be relaxing, but for a first timer it's anything but that at first. It's nerve-wracking. So for me, once I loosened up, then I could kind of relax my grip, fly with a couple fingers, and get used to how the plane felt in the air. The other bad habit that I was starting to form that I had to break quickly was looking at the flight deck too much. Basically, I kept looking down at the instruments, looking at the throttle, looking at, the different headings and altimeter and stuff like that. But you really need to be looking out the window, not only to enjoy flying, but you need to be looking out for other aircraft. Make sure you're flying visually by what's outside. The instruments are great and they're incredibly useful and you need to use them, but those aren't going to tell you, these planes aren't smart enough to know if a plane's coming to crash into you. Mid-air collisions happen all the time, so you have to be on the lookout. And that was one of the first things my flight instructor said to me was, today, if anything, you're going to be the other pair of eyes and make sure if you see anything out there, you tell me. Other than a couple small tweaks, things were going pretty well. We went and flew around locally. We got to even fly by my house and other landmarks that I recognized. Did a bunch of maneuvers, and then we started heading back towards the airport. As we were heading back to the airport, my flight instructor asked if I wanted to land the plane, which, I'll be honest, is probably one of the more nerve-wracking parts of flying. It seems way more difficult. It's a lot more timing, and I still would have done it. However, as we were coming into the traffic pattern, 2 or 3 other planes were coming in at the same time. So my flight instructor, out of the need for time, landed the plane for us. That way we weren't backing things up, and especially being a student, I see where he's coming from. It could take me a couple attempts to get the landing right, or God forbid something happens and now you have multiple aircraft circling the airport. So he landed the plane. It's just such a weird feeling as you're just kind of gliding in, and it feels so fast and so slow at the same time that you come in, you land, and then it's like when you're flying on a big 747, you feel the brakes hit the ground and it feels like everything's shaking and rumbling. So it was pretty cool. Overall, my discovery flight was a rush and well worth the experience. Ever since that day, I've been constantly looking at flight stuff. How to get this certification, how to get this rating, how many hours do I need, where can I fly, all the different rules. I even look at planes for sale, even though I cannot afford one, but that's okay. But while we're talking about it, how much was a discovery flight? I'm going to break down the cost for you. So to break it down, there's 3 different things that I got charged for. The plane, ground instruction, and flight instruction. So our total flight time was 1.2 hours. The aircraft rental itself for that 1.2 hours was $183. We had 1.2 hours of flight instructor time. That was $60. And we had 0.3 hours of ground instruction, which was $15. So for a total of $258 for 1.2 hours of flying. As you can see, most of that comes from the cost of the airplane. Now, I'm sure you could have shopped around and you could have found some kind of Groupon deal or a flight school offering some kind of special. But for me, this made the most sense because it was local. I could drive 15 minutes to the airport, get in the plane, there was nobody there, and get up in the air for what I found to be a relatively average price. So let's say we've got all of our ground instruction taken care of, we don't really need anything, we just need to log hours. So for 1 hour, that comes out to about $203 an hour. So let's say we don't need ground instruction anymore, we just need to log our hours to get our private pilot's license. For 1 hour, the aircraft costs $153 to rent and $50 an hour for the flight instruction. So that gives us an average of $203 per hour of flight training. If we do some rough math, we need to hit the minimum of 40 hours to get our private pilot's license. So that right there, if you take the $203 an hour times 40, that comes out to $8,160 on the low end of our private pilot's license training. If we want to look at some upper ends, what I read online, a lot of people take 50 to 60 hours because they need to practice things. There's certain maneuvers that they struggle with. So I'm banking on that as well. There may be something I need to work on. I haven't gotten to that point where I've discovered what that is. But if we do the same math at 60 hours to give us an upper limit, that comes out to $12,180 as the upper limit. So about $8,100 to $12,100 is our possible range that we could be looking to spend for a private pilot's license. Granted, that's if you go through a flight school where you're renting their plane. There's cheaper options. If you know somebody with an airplane who can take you up, you might be able to find a way to get it for much cheaper, because as you can see, $150 of it is the aircraft. The other 50 or 60 is the flight instructor. So I'm sure you could work it out if you have some kind of thing going there. Otherwise, if you're like me, you have to go through a flight school and pay for everything. So that $8,000 to $12,000 range is specifically flight time. That does not include your gear, your ground school, books, anything that you might need to get your private pilot's license. So it can be an expensive endeavor, and for me, I need to space things out over time to make it happen. There's people that can go and get this in a few weeks. They can pursue this and dump all their money all at once, rush through the training. I unfortunately am taking the long route, so I'm going to fly when I can, when it makes sense. Unfortunately, I have to strike a balance between not letting my skills progress. I need to keep up with my skills, but I also need to afford it. So I need to find a balance there where I'm not going 6 months without flying. I need to try to go at least once a month. They recommended once a week. I'm not doing that. It just doesn't make financial sense for me. It's a hobby. This isn't a career for me yet. So for me, I'm going to go every month when I can, go for a flight, log some hours, learn some things, practice it on the simulator at home, and then hopefully we'll get our license that way. Here's one more cool thing about the Discovery flight. Once we got back, my instructor and I sat down and he filled out a logbook for me. So basically, the Discovery flight was mostly just flight instruction. I got 1.2 hours logged toward my private pilot's license. So it was expensive at $258, but this is like just becoming a student at the flight school. I've logged my hours, so now I can just keep on going back and doing that. I don't know if that's always going to be the case if you do a Discovery flight at a different school, but for me, that was my experience. So to wrap things up, if you have any kind of general interest in aviation, I would highly recommend going for a Discovery flight. I think there's a lot of cool things you can learn. It's a new experience, and it'll give you more of an affinity for the aviation world. So find your local airport, give a flight school a chance. So far, all the instructors that I did meet at the school were all super friendly and helpful. So I think it's just that kind of community where everybody loves aviation and wants to help. It's not, this standoffish kind of industry or competitive. Everyone wants to learn this because it's just fun and fascinating. So get out there and try Discovery flight as soon as you can. Well, thank you so much for watching, guys. It means a lot. Like and subscribe, and hopefully we can get you some new content soon.